I saw a video on X of Zara Sultana. It was basically telling a very large crowd, we're not going to beg for crumbs from the table, we're going to take it all. Which really does sound like a call for mass expropriation and confiscation in an age of mass dissatisfaction, where everybody hates what's happening, but no one really has the ideas. We seem to have just carried on doing what the EU does, or in some cases we've gone further. Unless you're prepared to deal with those issues, then I think making fiscal conservatism your unique selling point rings a little hollow. They didn't do the work in opposition. They didn't know what they wanted to do.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here, and today I am joined by, as always, Tom Clougherty, our Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. Now, it's been a busy week politically, various things flying about. On the agenda for us today is the battle for the heart of the Labour Party, which we're all on the edge of our seats for, the Tories turning once again to fiscal conservatism, and what is the CMA planning for Apple and Google. Before we dive in, though, do remember to comment, like, and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, we do read everything, or try and read everything at least. And do go and subscribe to us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk to get all of our content, podcasts, blogs, events straight to your inbox. So, starting with the Conservatives, this week Kemi Badenoch delivered a speech in which she promised to offer a serious helping hand to Keir Starmer in, quote, the national interest to help the government cut the welfare bill. They're very concerned about the government having to go to the IMF and the general fiscal situation that they find themselves in. Tom, why does this matter? What's the significance of that?
Yeah, look, I think it's easy to be cynical about this grand offer. I think it's a political statement. People will reasonably say, well, you were opposed to the government's attempts to cut old age welfare, like the winter fuel payments, and you were all ready to vote against the government's plans to change welfare. Well, okay, oppositions are there to oppose and everything, but it does look like a sort of change of direction there. What I think is interesting, and so the big headlines that came from this Kemi Badenoch speech earlier in the week were all about her offering to sit down with Labour and come up with a way to cut welfare spending, and saying if they worked up something collaboratively, then the Tories would, do a 3-line whip and get their people to vote it through, so that it could pass the House of Commons, even if the left of the Labour Party was rebelling against it. So you can sort of see what the political gambit there is, and that's interesting in its own way. But what I thought was really interesting about this speech is what it says about how the Conservative Party sees itself, what it sees its unique selling point in British politics as being. And for me, and you're hearing this privately a lot at the moment, I think they've decided that their big thing is fiscal conservatism, that they have to be the voice of, sound public finances, of keeping spending under control, of balancing the books and everything else. Now, I think this is a kind of an honourable position to take. It's one that I personally tend to agree with. Whether it works for them politically is another question. It seems in a way a little bit retro, doesn't it? Because yes, David Cameron, George Osborne, this was sort of the message in 2010. This was the message in 2015. I think that as much as the kind of idea of Tory austerity lingered on later, it really was put to bed in the Boris Johnson administration before COVID-19 even landed on these shores. Boris was abandoning austerity, spending was being ramped up, perhaps not particularly rapidly, but those taps were certainly opening. And then you got a massive uplift in spending during the pandemic as well. And then you had the brief Liz Truss interlude as well, which I know people will point to and say, well, how can the Conservatives claim to be all about balanced budgets after that? Nevertheless, I think that this is a genuine thing from Kemi Badenoch and many of her sort of senior cabinet members and stuff. They really do think it's important to balance the books. They see, as we talk about often, that Britain is living beyond its means, that we need to have a conversation about what government can do and what government can't do if we're going to, bring that all under control. Here's the thing, though. How radical are they prepared to be? Because I know that the one thing that it's extremely unlikely the Conservative Party is going to do is go anywhere near entitlements for older voters. And we know, because we talk about it all the time, that at least over the long term, that is the big driver of public spending pressure. It's the state pension, it's public sector pensions, it's social care, it's healthcare for the elderly, and so on. Unless you're prepared to deal with those issues, then I think making fiscal conservatism your unique selling point rings a little hollow. That being said, if they've decided no one else is doing fiscal conservatism, Labour won't do it in one direction, Reform won't do it in the other, this is the gap for us in British politics. I think it's good that there is a voice for balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility, even if we can be sceptical about how successful that's going to be politically at this point in time.
Yeah, the trouble with it is that, so I've watched the speech as well, and as is often the case with conservative politicians, I like the sound of it in the abstract, but as soon as it gets a bit more specific, I stop liking it. So there was one journalist in the audience who asked, okay, what if this fiscal committee, or whatever you want to call it, that you want to set up with Labour, what if this organization comes up and says, or the Labour side of it, what if they come up and say, we will abolish or modify the triple lock? And then Kemi Badenoch immediately said, no, in that case, we're not going to do it. Now, I thought the whole point of an arrangement like that would be that it is effectively like a non-aggression pact between the parties, right? Where they mutually agree, look, we will not attack you if you promote unpopular savings that are difficult for you. If, and on the other hand, as a quid pro quo, you are not going to attack us if we propose something that's difficult from our perspective. And this is, of course, the thing. It's so in response to that question, Kemi Badenoch immediately tried to steer the conversation back to working age benefits, working age entitlements. Well, okay, from her perspective, that's the easy part, because the Conservative Party or the centre right more generally doesn't have working age voters. Right? They are just a pensioner project at this stage. So this is relatively easy for her. It's trickier for Labour. So it would make sense, therefore, maybe to have a pact like this if it means Labour can come up with things, with proposals to reduce old age entitlements, and yeah, at the same time, the Conservatives maybe can come up with things that are difficult for Labour, and you rule nothing out in advance. You then work this out behind closed doors, and you just come to this agreement that that you own it jointly. That if it gets attacked, you tell the opposition to it in advance. You would have to attack both of us. This is we both own this, and it's not that one side is going to play politics and say, "Oh, come to us," and what these bad people are doing to you. In that way, that's the only way in which it could really make sense, because it's not. That arrangement is not going to lead to fundamentally novel ideas, right? Because that's not really the problem. It's not that nobody knows what to do. The proposals are all there. You can probably find think tank reports from 30 years ago that already say this is nothing really new under the sun there. Yeah, if at all, it can only make sense as a non-aggression pact. And if one side immediately says, oh, but we won't talk about things that are difficult for us, then it's not going to work.
Indeed, I think the problem is that the political incentives are still there and will basically always be there. And the only way that those incentives change so significantly to move to this sort of government in the national interest, when like we had during the war, is if voters really feel like it's at that level of direness. It's like a proper crisis. The Conservative Party has historically done quite well being actually we can't quite afford that party. So the British voters tend to see sense in that and tend to generally agree, and that's when they've been quite successful. But if they don't think that things are that bad, if they're too worried about other things, maybe immigration, maybe the state of the healthcare system, then there's just not going to be that much political hay in it for either party, really.
Yeah. I mean, let's be clear, though. We do have a real fiscal problem in this country. We have a relatively large and very persistent deficit that, what are we now, 15, 16 years on from the financial crisis? We never quite got round to balancing the books again. It was always sort of on track towards balance in a few years' time, but never quite getting there. At the same time, because growth has been so weak, and it looks like being weak out into the future without some changes in policy, the pressure on tax revenues is probably going to be downwards. They're likely to disappoint, even if the government raises tax rates, and we may be at the point where that brings diminishing marginal returns. Similarly, when you do have problems with working age welfare, you have, falling labour market participation. You have a big rise in people being out of work or working less because of mental health or physical health issues. You have an ageing population, which is pretty quickly going to start putting significant upward pressure on spending. People want to spend more on defence. People want to spend more on all sorts of things, frankly. Politicians always say when you're in the Treasury, you have all of your colleagues coming to you and asking for more spending. Hardly anyone ever comes and proposes a cut. So just the dynamics of parliamentary politics point in that direction as well. So there's a big problem there. There's no easy solution. In a sense, I think probably many of the politicians that do worry about this stuff and would like to see change, probably in the back of their mind, they're just hoping that the financial markets will come along and enforce the discipline at some stage. And I think that's why you get some of this. They seem to me like kind of fantasies of the IMF coming in and telling us what to do so we could do the things we knew we had to do anyway. But I don't think we're there yet. And this is the problem really with public perception. I think the public, unfortunately, are very happy with the unreality of the current system, where we raise a certain amount in taxes and we won't pay any more. And we want to spend this much on public services. And actually, we'd like to spend more than that if we can. And people just aren't prepared to reconcile that gap in expectations. And at some point, I think we're going to need to. And so, there's a public education thing to do here. But I do think it's extremely welcome if there is a force in politics which is making the case for fiscal conservatism.
It's definitely welcome, and it is also probably the right political move. Things aren't going well for the Tories at the moment, obviously politically, but if they are to sort of mount a comeback, this is probably the way to do it, because this is where there's clearly water between both the Labour Party, who we'll come on to shortly, and Reform. So Reform is obviously on the rise on the right, if you like, and giving the Tories a very hard time across the board, really. But actually their fiscal plans leave a little bit to be desired on this front. It's all sort of, we want to cut waste, and that will sort of plug the gap, and then we'll give away lots of tax cuts and more benefits as well.
So in a way, I think it's a bit unfair to accuse Reform of having a fiscal plan at all, which maybe is more damning than the alternative. But yes, they had plans in their last election manifesto, which I think are widely seen to be, shall we say, a little bit optimistic in terms of the savings that can be made from things like DEI, net zero, government waste, scrapping interest on reserves at the central bank, with no plan for how you would actually conduct monetary policy in the absence of paying interest on reserves. That is the main tool of monetary policy at the moment, and so on. So they were proposing some big tax cuts, raising the personal allowance to 20,000 from 12,500 where it is at the moment, scrapping business rates, which I think in principle you can make a strong case for. In practice, it's going to be a fairly big and immediate handout to corporate landlords. But in the long run, it's probably the right policy. No reason why business property should be taxed as an input into production. But anyway, these things don't really add up. But I also don't think, and I think Richard Tice maybe has said this himself, that they don't really consider themselves bound by the last general election manifesto. They are where they are now, and really they're trying to come up with a whole new policy agenda, which may not bear much resemblance to previous policy agendas that have borne the Reform title. So I think come election time, there's still a pretty grand scope for where Reform could end up, for better and for worse, on a whole range of different issues.
Yes.
Well, do they really have that much scope? And the trouble is, right now they are pretty much exclusively a culture war party. And therefore, there's probably not a single voter in the country who says, I support Reform because I really like their tax proposals or their healthcare policies. Right now, they can get away with being a culture war party. And even to the extent that they have fiscal policies, even they are approached through that lens, right? When they talk about cutting back DEI spending. Okay, there clearly the message is this is woke nonsense, and then this is something that we don't like anyway. But then the thing with woke nonsense is you should be against it because it's nonsense, not because you think this is where the big potential for savings lie, because there quite clearly isn't. Anything that can be expressed in millions is rounding error. If you're below billions, then it's not really worth talking about. And now, okay, it could well be that, say, them doing well in the polls, there being a possibility that they could form part of a government coalition. Could be that forces them to spend a bit more time thinking about economics, even if that isn't their core topic. It's just that as soon as they start doing that, they will run into the same constraints as the Conservatives, which is that their electoral base is pretty much the same. They're fishing in the same pots. They're also a boomer party. They're competing for the same baby boomer vote, and that means they will not be able to go anywhere near old age entitlements. And well, that's where the big savings lie.
Yeah. Well, I think there is a question there, actually. I mean, your voter demographics aren't necessarily your electoral destiny. I think you do see times where, first of all, people don't always vote their rational self-interest, if you want to put it in those terms. I think you can win people over with ideas and narratives and shift the climate of opinion. And I think maybe there is, if you have a political movement which just has a kind of hunger for radicalism, there's always a chance. I'm not saying it's a huge chance, but that they might actually do something meaningful in some of these areas.
There's a world in which they sort of deliver why I think lots of people are crying out for, that sort of vision for a better Britain on the hill. And they could, there's a world in which you could wrap up radical reform to old age benefits, like the truffle lot could say, actually, no, this is broken. The whole thing's broken. So we are going to take that away. But instead, this is what we're going to give you. And if you wrap that up with a whole sort of, that may be an easier message for reform to deliver than the Tories' honest.
I mean, in a sense, this is the question. Can the undoubted energy behind populist movements to smash things up and, take apart the status quo, can that be channeled in a productive direction to do real, deep, meaningful structural reforms? I don't know. This may not be how politics works, but I think, obviously people want to win power. Presumably, though, they want to win power to do something with it and to have a lasting impact. And so, I think anyone who has a chance to win an election a few years out probably ought to be thinking very closely about a whole range of different policy issues. And look, I think that the kind of start that Labour has got off to the point where actually people are writing off the current government and they don't seem to have much of a legislative agenda just over a year in, that is, in my view, in large part because they didn't do the work in opposition. They didn't know what they wanted to do or how they were going to do it when they took power. I think in their case, they expected regulators and civil servants to be able to tell them. And they found out, no, it doesn't quite work that way.
Entirely agree, which brings us perfectly onto the next topic, which is what is going on in the governing party at the moment. We'll stay away from the political commentary of reshuffles and deputy leadership contests, but what is happening is the start of a bit of a debate within the Labour Party that will be broadcast to the nation, thanks to the deputy leadership contest, about what direction they want to go in, and issues like the Employment Rights Bill, given Angela Rayner was leading that and is no longer in government, and how much they want to focus on growth and what they will sacrifice to deliver that. And then sort of more specific things like the two-child benefit cap. These issues are going to come to the fore again from within government because of what's going on. What Kristian, I'll turn to you on this. What hope do you think, if we build the Labour debate at the moment as being between Reeves and Starmer, who are generally pro-growth, or at least make all the right noises and want that to be the focus, versus the, say, soft left, Andy Burnham, be a little bit more generous on benefits, maybe rethink the fiscal rules a little bit, not full Corbynism, but somewhere in between. Which direction do you think they're going to go in?
Well, that was always the danger, that if the more growth-focused, say, abundance-inspired wing of the Labour Party, so that was always skin deep and very much a last-minute thing that they just discovered 5 minutes before the election, and it was never really deeply grounded. It was never what got them out of bed in the morning. And therefore, the danger was always that if that agenda doesn't deliver, then all the bad ideas will once again come to the fore. And that's why when you have moments where the party is doing badly, that's when they fall back on things like wealth taxes, when things like that come up again. And I'm sure if things get worse, we will also get renewed calls for rent controls. All the usual textbook bad stuff is going to come up again. And that's why it's such a shame that I think we were even on this podcast, mildly hopeful that maybe the YIMBY abundance agenda, if that starts to deliver, if they really go for this and generate some growth, then there you could have a situation where even the more reluctant Labour Party members, even those who do not wholeheartedly support this, would say, well, okay, in a way, you guys, you have delivered. You must be doing something right. It's not really my heart and soul issue. It's not that this is where that this is the hill I want to die on, but you must be doing something right. Go on, carry on doing that. And since they've quite quickly gambled away that chance for now, well, there's nothing else left other than the bad old ideas. So that was the problem, that they started quite well on some things. Say with increased land release targets and all that, but then counteracted all that immediately with what we talked about last time, the new buildings regulator, and even things like landfill taxes now coming up, making development unviable in other ways, where if they're not generating growth through an abundance light strategy, then there is nothing else that they have.
Yeah. And I think it was striking to sort of read the rumour that they want to do a second planning bill when they haven't actually passed the first one yet, I think, which is a sign that they think, well, we didn't really go far enough on that. It's interesting just to look at this maybe this splintering of the left, which may be occurring. So, look, I mean, I actually don't see, unfortunately, much of the kind of abundance left, the supply side progressivism in the government at the moment. I mean, maybe there are little hints of that here and there, but it's not, as Kristian said, it was sort of skin deep. There wasn't really this desire to properly liberalise anything, I don't think. To the extent that you still have some of that rhetoric, and you've had Rachel Reeves this week talking about, we're talking tough on regulation, getting rid of more regulators. Again, well, I mean, look, they got rid of one regulator, the payment services regulator, but as far as I can tell, they simply transferred all of its responsibilities and staff into the Financial Conduct Authority. So it's one less institution, but has it actually changed the scope or the style of the regulatory state? No, not really. But at least that's encouraging. But so, what I see basically is, on the one hand, you have what you might term the Treasury view, which is a sort of an adherence to the fiscal rules, which means because they're afraid to touch spending, taxes are going to go up again. So we're going to try and balance the books that way, coupled with a sort of fairly basic deregulatory strategy, but that doesn't really dig beneath the surface very much. And I mean, so, say what you like about the Treasury. There are many bad things about the Treasury. I think the good things about the Treasury are they actually do want to balance the budgets. They are, in a sense, fiscally conservative, even if they don't really think about the economic consequences of tax increases and the dynamic effects that much. So they're quite happy to put taxes up to close any fiscal gap. But they are sort of responsible with the nation's fiscal resources. Institutionally, this is their tendency. And the Treasury actually has always talked to the game and been enthusiastic about regulatory reform to try and encourage more growth, from planning to a range of other issues. Now, the problem is they might be in favour of it at the Treasury, but they don't really have that much control over other departments' regulatory plans. So on the one hand, you have the very centre of government maybe talking up this deregulatory strategy. But then when you look at what's going on elsewhere, well, it's the Workers' Rights Bill, which all of the business groups are sort of uniquely coming out together to condemn as imposing too much cost on business, on being an anti-competitive, anti-growth move. You have the Renters' Rights Bill, which there was a story, I think, in the paper today or yesterday, that rental listings are currently falling at the fastest rate since the first COVID-19 lockdown. You have the net zero stuff, the agenda going on. Now, there was some speculation, no idea whether it's true, that they tried to move Ed Miliband to a different brief. Does that indicate that maybe at the centre of government they'd like to water down the net zero agenda a little bit? Possibly, but it's not going to happen. And so in every way that matters, things are going kind of in the wrong direction if you want this pro-abundance, liberalisation, pro-growth agenda. And so that's sort of what defines the government. And then you've got this debate. Well, obviously you've got the far left splitting off. And I saw a video on X of Zara Sultana. But I'll remove the swear words from what she said. But it was basically telling a very large crowd, we're not going to beg for crumbs from the table. We're going to take it all. Which really does sound like a call for like mass expropriation and confiscation. Is it surprising coming from that direction? No, not terribly. And then maybe somewhere in the middle between this slightly muddled, philosophically incoherent centre-left government that we've got at the moment, and then the hard left over here, you have what calls itself the popular left, which was always nice to brand yourself as popular. The proof is in the pudding, I suppose. But which is just a little bit more openly, left-wing, but without being extreme about it. And as you say, would increase taxes on the wealthy to spend more on public services, would probably be, more environmentally friendly, would be more outspoken against Israel's military actions in Gaza, and so on and so forth. And so all of this is playing out. Like, maybe the big picture here is, in a sense, our first segment was talking about the splintering of the British right, which, it's happened in grand style, and I'm not sure that's coming back together anytime soon. And so you have different economic approaches, different degrees of social conservatism, etc., etc. If the left is splitting up as well, having just won a massive sort of generational, in a way, election victory, what does that say about our politics in general? What does that say about the prospects for policy reform, for meaningful change in the direction that we'd like to see? Unfortunately, it does appear to me that we're, our colleague Steve Davis has talked about this, we're just mired in an age of mass dissatisfaction where everybody hates what's happening, but no one really has the ideas or the ability to do something fundamentally different. Now, we can keep hoping for something fundamentally different to come along, but I think the danger is we just get stuck in a rut where everyone's unhappy, power changes hands, but things just get worse and worse. And I'm sounding like Kristian all of a sudden now. I'm normally the optimistic one on this podcast.
But it is happening. You also see that the Sultana party, or the Your party, whatever, and the Greens, they are now basically ignoring the Conservatives, or even Labour largely, and make it directly about them versus reform. And so you already have the more populist ends at both ends of the spectrum. They are now essentially having a go fully at each other, and what used to be the party duopoly, two-party system for a long time, and that's basically almost redundant at this station.
Yeah. But it comes back to what you spoke about earlier, the sort of fantasy that the IMF or the financial markets are going to come in and sort of enforce the change that we really need. We're sort of in that world a little bit already, in that the government has been restrained enough by the financial markets to at least keep Rachel Reeves in place. I mean, they sort of announced a huge reshuffle is going to kick off this afternoon, but in the same sentence, but Rachel Reeves isn't going anywhere, don't worry.
Right.
So is that just yet another sign that actually we're not going to get, even if your view is the sort of accelerationist, we just need it all to burn down so we can build something new, that actually it's not even going to get, we're just going to keep sort of dangling by a thread?
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, I don't think the personalities matter all that much here. It's the principles and the practice which is more important. But secondly, I think that accelerationist view is, okay, maybe once in a blue moon there'll be a crisis and you get some good outcomes from it. But I think probably on balance, crises tend to lead things in an even worse direction from our perspective. I don't think there's really any alternative to kind of fighting and winning the battle of ideas. And, political realignment in partisan terms may just be a fact that political parties are going to look and sound different in future than they have in the past. The question is, I think, how much free market thinking, how much individualism, how much classical liberalism, which frankly has been sort of politically homeless for a long time, and will occasionally find that kind of thinking will occasionally find itself in coalition with other political groups. How much of that can be injected into whatever kind of new politics emerges?
Well, if we've got anything to do about it, quite a lot, but we'll see. Just before we wrap up, we are going to speak a little bit about the Competition and Markets Authority. This is extremely much more from the big to the extremely technical, but it's still very interesting. What the Competition and Markets Authority is proposing to do with Apple and Google's mobile operations. Tom, do you want to walk us through it?
Yeah, well, I think this is just one to watch, really, at this stage. And there was a column I read from a Stanford Law School professor in the FT, basically calling for structural breaking up of the big tech companies, or if you can't do that, then actively stopping these big platforms from emerging in the first place by stopping mergers, stopping takeovers, and all of this kind of stuff. He was bemoaning that even when big tech companies in the US had been found to violate antitrust law, they were the regulators and the courts weren't imposing big structural solutions. Now, I read that and I thought this really sounds like a solution in search of a problem, and I feel that way with so much digital competition discussion at the moment. And so the UK angle on this is at the most. So the Digital Competition Act last year, a couple of years ago, whenever it was, brought in by Conservative Party, by the way, with their supposedly free market leanings, despite lots of advice from people on the free market side that this was a bad idea to give too much power to regulators. But basically, it gives the Competition and Markets Authority the ability to designate companies in particular areas as giving them strategic market status. And if they're deemed to have strategic market status, that means the regulator can interfere in a much more kind of micro way. So it can apply, very specific targeted regulations and regulatory guidance to them, rather than having to make kind of general rules that apply to business in general or to sectors in general, which is the way I think it ought to work. They can actually try and interfere in particular businesses, in particular markets, in a way that is intended to encourage more competition. And so at the moment, they're looking at Google as a potential strategic market status for search and search advertising. Now, by the way, this seems kind of antiquated when I think probably from Google's perspective, they're terrified about the rise of LLMs, that suddenly if people are asking large language models for answers rather than search engines, well, now suddenly Google doesn't have the dominance of the market because ChatGPT is probably in the lead and you've got Claude and everything else. Google has their own one, of course, but this does seem to be a much less settled market. They're looking at Google and Apple for mobile platforms, for Android and iOS. And I think they're also looking at Microsoft and Amazon Web Services for kind of cloud computing and storage and everything else. So I just think this is a huge misstep in competition policy. It's kind of in the direction of what's been called hipster antitrust, or it's like it's focusing too much on these quite static measures of what a market looks like. What is the market share? What is the market concentration? And not really thinking dynamically enough from my perspective, because I think that if we think about these tech businesses, okay, they're big, they've got a lot of market share. And okay, those market shares might be relatively stable over time. But are these really uncompetitive markets? Is there a lack of innovation? Is there a lack of dynamism? I think this is mistaking some kind of macro stats for an accurate picture of what's actually going on under the surface. And what's actually going on under the surface is really like quite vicious competition. These companies are, I think, would consider themselves, and really are, in a fight for the future of artificial intelligence and mobile technology and everything else. And for me, and maybe this will sound old-fashioned, or maybe it will seem just like common sense, the yardstick for competition policy, we really should go back to that consumer welfare standard. Like, are consumers losing out? And if you can't show consumer detriment, I don't think there's a role for regulators to be getting involved here. So that's the sort of standard competition law point of view. But I also think there's a particular issue here of British competitiveness. And okay, we moan about why don't we have our own tech sector? Why does only America and China as well really have a tech sector that's doing big things? It's because we regulate the heck out of it in Britain and in Europe. And this is just such a massive misstep. Post-Brexit, the sweet spot for Britain, I think, was trying to find a divergent path actually trying to hit the regulatory sweet spot where we could have much lighter touch, much better, more pro-competition, more pro-growth regulatory regimes than the EU and maybe than the US as well. There was an opportunity for competitive divergence. Actually, we seem to have just carried on doing what the EU does, or in some cases we've gone further and done worse things. And yeah, just what a mistake in my view. And it kind of beggars belief in a way that a government paying lip service to free market ideas and sort of talking pro-tech and innovation and let's attract investment has given these powers to a regulator, which I think are going to prove extremely costly.
Well, that's the trouble. It does, as you say, already sound antiquated. So I remember a few years ago, the argument was about platforms like Google that a market dominant position is self-reinforcing. That you have once a platform is extremely big, that means the more people use it, the more data goes into it, and the better it gets. And therefore, you cannot just set up a small competitor because you're just never going to get to that stage where you can't even compete with the big guy, because the big guy is the one that has the most users, and therefore it's just going to get bigger and bigger over time. That was the argument a few years ago, but before AI became as big as it is now. And yes, the counter argument was, of course, that okay, this may be true on the base of current technology, but something else will come along surely, if that ever becomes a problem, or even if it doesn't. And that is what has now happened. That this AI explosion, this is what nobody could have foreseen in this form, or maybe some industry experts did. But from the perspective of an outside observer, it looked like something that happened very rapidly and came out of the blue. So this idea that you have a behemoth that nobody can challenge, where size is self-cementing and self-perpetuating, is no longer true now. And I also wonder what happened at the Competition and Markets Authority. I used to see them as broadly, obviously that they are a technocratic institution. They wouldn't say that they have a particular ideological leaning, but to the extent that they had one, I would have thought a few years ago that they're broadly on the same wavelength as we are. So I remember using one of their reports when I was writing about airport slots allocation, and they criticized the current system, which is essentially central planning by the regulator allocating slots on airports. They criticized that in a language that sounded almost Hayekian. So they didn't literally cite Hayek, but they talked about how that regulator which allocates these slots isn't going to possess the relevant knowledge, and that knowledge is probably only going to exist in the minds of market participants, and we need to find a way of accessing it, of making the market participants, which in this case is the airlines, reveal the knowledge that they have through their actions in a competitive market. And I thought, well, okay, obviously Hayek himself never wrote about airport slots, but if he had, that's what he would have said. And therefore, I could very easily use a lot of their materials and had basically nothing to add to that. I wonder what happened. They seem to have taken a much more interventionist direction.
And I think actually the government has recognised this and tried to change course a little bit. I think they removed the chief executive or the chairman, I forget which one it was, of the CMA earlier in the year, because they were worried about the kind of burden that it was imposing on business. I think actually one of the things going on here, it shows why sector-specific regulation is such a problem, as opposed to applying the general rule book to all kinds of different businesses. Because I think, you look at Ofcom and you look at the CMA, it's the sense that digital is different somehow. And the standard analysis that we apply to other areas of competition policy or communications regulation, it has to be completely different. And it has to be much more heavy-handed. And I think it was towards the end of the last Conservative government when they had one of many grand deregulatory strategies came out. But they ditched the previous target to reduce the measured business impact of regulation, and they also ditched the kind of the one in 2 out, 1 in 3 out kind of rules that they had, because they said this is nice in principle, but it's just not consistent with the reality of emerging technologies which require special regulation and environmental challenges which require special regulation. And I think that was almost an admission of defeat, basically. It was an intellectual capitulation to say that, no, actually, overall, the amount of regulation we have is going to go up no matter what. This is a mindset, I think, that fundamentally needs to change. And it's one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about recently, and maybe I've even mentioned it on this podcast already, but the way in which, when the IA was founded, the big intellectual battle that needed to be won was between planning and markets, effectively. Are we top-down central planners? Are we Keynesian fine-tuners? Or do we believe in the market process, spontaneous order to allocate resources? The similar but slightly different big intellectual debate now, I think, is kind of between bureaucracy and agency. And of course, one is about control and one is about freedom and entrepreneurship. But it's much more about process and management of process and drowning everything in rules and trying to limit risk and trying to sort of steer outcomes, but not necessarily plan them from the top down. That, to me, is the kind of intellectual paradigm of policy today. It's about risk aversion and it's about regulation and it's about bureaucratic process, more so than it is about top-down central planning. But I think it is failing in exactly the same way as its intellectual predecessor, and that is fundamentally the key target that people who believe in growth and freedom and enterprise need to be going after.
That's really interesting. How do you transpose that theory then of the new sort of split onto the topics we were talking about earlier and the sort of the current policy debates going on in Westminster and more broadly in the political parties?
Yeah, so I think that in a way, if there is this energy to smash up the old way of doing things, that could be extremely destructive, or it could, just be unhelpful, achieve little. And I think in a way you saw this with Elon Musk's brief sojourn into the US federal government as well. The sort of tech spirit of move fast and break things, but without a kind of coherent, overarching plan and rationale, didn't seem to deliver the kind of results that I was maybe optimistic that it would. But can you channel that same energy into just trying to deconstruct this whole edifice? You can call it the administrative state or the bureaucratic state or the regulatory state or whatever. And I'm not necessarily saying the alternative has to be 100% pure, unadulterated, laissez-faire. But I also think that almost everyone can agree in their own ways, from the centre-left to the centre-right and maybe beyond in each direction, that we don't really want this massive bureaucratic state just strangling the life out of everything. And so if you can take some of that energy to really change things and really shake things up and use it to dismantle that apparatus, then I think maybe you could be talking about something productive.
But is there anyone on the side of the bureaucratic state? So back in the 20th century, there were people who were proudly Keynesians and thought of planning was good. But is there anyone going, actually, bureaucracy is good and we need more of it?
Yeah, but that isn't really new. That's always been the problem that, and Hayek made this point in the 40s, that the central planners of his state didn't usually call themselves central planners, that they didn't say, we want everything to be run from Whitehall by unelected bureaucratic institutions. So they simply said, well, we want everything to be run by the people democratically. And that was his argument that is not achievable, really. That ultimately, if you have the state doing lots of things, and especially highly specialized and technical things, then the state needs to outsource it to essentially specialized organizations. And he didn't call them quangos or technocrats, but that was essentially the sentiment even then. And then he said, but that's going to be completely inevitable. And he cited one labor socialist, Harold Lasky, big admirer of the Soviet Union, who was completely on the same page with him on that topic. Perhaps he was the only one who did openly defend what you could call the bureaucratic state. And but we can see this now again on the populist right, that there is this anger against, they rail and rage against technocrats, quangos, bureaucrats. But for them, without really talking about, okay, what should the state do, though? It's more about how should it do it? And for them, it's about transferring power from unelected to elected organizations, from bureaucrats to elected politicians, to maybe parliament or parliamentary subcommittees. But then, of course, if the state does as much as it does now, and if it does things that are as highly technical and specific as what the state does now, especially when it comes to things like, wanting to legislate for a particular outcome in the tech sector or this sector, that sector, having a clear idea, I want this type of market and industry structure. Well, if you want the state to be this specific, then of course, that is not going to be all delivered by elected politicians. You're not going to have MPs who are going to be experts on the tech sector along with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of other highly specialized areas. Of course, at some point, they're going to say, well, this is going to be outsourced to a bunch of specialists, and we're not going to get involved with that. And yeah, so therefore, this kind of anti-bureaucracy anchor on its own, unless you're prepared to talk about what you want the state to do and what you don't want it to do, isn't going to lead us anywhere.
Yeah. And I think there's a danger. People like to talk about the blob, and they act as if there's a conspiracy against the public interest or the common good there. And no doubt there are a few bad actors. There are in any organisation or structure. But for the most part, I think if the people who are really worried about the blob get into power and go looking for it, they're going to be disappointed, because it's not so much a conspiracy of people proactively trying to overregulate and sort of drain the entrepreneurial zeal out of everything. It's so much more about inertia and path dependence and bureaucratic processes, and people basically just being stuck in a machine or a program which delivers these increasingly undesirable outcomes, but that no one actually is controlling or directing or feels empowered to change.
So how do you fix it?
Yeah, asking all the hard questions today, aren't you? No, I mean, I think basically you have to basically ditch large parts of the regulatory mindset. You have to be much more relaxed about risk, about caveat emptor, and you have to say, actually, okay, the goal of the central planners or the Keynesian fine-tuners was a noble one. They didn't want worse outcomes. It just so happened that the things they were doing, which they thought were for the good, turned out to lead to bad outcomes. In the same way, we can talk about this from a very intellectual perspective and say we should have higher risk appetites and we should allow more spontaneous order and we shouldn't close off avenues for innovation and stuff. Most people won't be thinking that way, and they'll think, well, we're trying to reduce risk. Risk is bad. That seems like a good thing to do, to take risks out, to protect people from bad outcomes. I think what you've got to get across is that no, this doesn't actually work. It doesn't really reduce risk. And even if it does reduce risk, then the costs don't justify the reduction in risk that goes alongside it. So I think you have to change that mindset. I mean, you basically have to, there's no point just scrapping structures or firing people if all the rules remain the same. Or if the kind of sources of the rules remain there and it just keeps coming and coming, like an ever-rising tide. You have to actually change the mindset and say that this experiment that we've had probably over the last 40 years, more or less over my lifetime, is a failed one. And that the kind of highly complex, massively interfering regulatory state that we have today just doesn't do us any good.
That's a good place to end it. We got a little bit off the CMA there, but for the good, I think. That was a fascinating conversation. Thank you both. And thank you too for listening or watching wherever you are consuming this podcast. As always, do subscribe so you don't miss next week's. Until next time, thank you very much.